All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this North Carolina Botanical Garden Lunchbox Talk. We thank you all for being here today via Zoom. We got folks tuning in from across the southeastern United States, as well as a couple folks in New York and California. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is David Michaud. I'm the Program and Engagement Coordinator here at the Garden, and I'm joined by Lauren Green, who is our Youth Environmental Education Specialist. Deb Maurer completed her master's degree in botany from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then spent the next 17 years studying, restoring, and managing natural areas in Northeast Illinois and Southeast Wisconsin. With a keen interest in restoration ecology and adaptive management, she helped restore thousands of acres of woodlands, prairies, and wetlands along Lake Michigan and worked with partners across the Chicago region and Midwest on a variety of conservation issues, including addressing the threat of invasive species and advancing the use of controlled burning. In 2018, she joined the Nature Conservancy in North Carolina as the Southeast Coastal Plain Program Director, and now leads a team of 11 people focusing on the protection, restoration, and management of longleaf pine savanna, pocosin, and freshwater systems from the sandhills to the coast. Fire management is the most important tool for managing longleaf and other fire-driven systems, and Deb continues to burn on fire crews and recently added aerial ignition with a drone to her program. And I think we'll see some drone footage in this presentation, so stay tuned. With Deb's love for plants, ecology, and fire, the Southeast Coastal Plain of North Carolina is a perfect fit. Deb, we thank you so much for being with us today. I'll stop sharing my screen and invite you to share yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I appreciate that. Let me get into this presentation, and thank you all who are here. Thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with folks about fire and longleaf. It's something I think about pretty much every single day. And I feel like it's for this series, it is a really important topic to cover. Just briefly, so I am with the Nature Conservancy with the North Carolina chapter, and for those of you that don't know much about the Nature Conservancy, we are an organization that works across North America and internationally. The North Carolina chapter, I am blessed to be with this organization and this chapter, and we do work from the mountains to the coast. And my program focuses on the southeast part of the state, largely on the longleaf pine ecosystem, as well as blackwater streams, working on the Cape Fear with our water program. So we do a lot of work across a variety of ecosystems, but one of our main focus for the last 30 years has been longleaf pine. And I know for those of you that have tuned into other webinars, the question of why protect longleaf pine is redundant. I'm sure you've heard it. But for those of you that haven't, the longleaf pine ecosystem is really amazing. From afar, just at a glimpse, looking at the trees only, you wonder, why is this such an important place? But it truly is a hotspot for biodiversity globally. The historical range of longleaf was from Virginia to eastern Texas down into Florida. And it may not be so diverse in the actual tree species that make up the canopy, like we have in our deciduous forests of the mountains, but there is extreme diversity in the ground layer in the plants that you find in the understory and in the wildlife that utilize the habitat and the plants for forage and the insects and all of that. Just very, very diverse system. And longleaf itself as a community type ranges significantly from Virginia to Texas. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of described longleaf pine communities, and that's based on a variety of characteristics. But longleaf is an amazing place to work, and it's an important ecological as well as cultural space for us to be investing our conservation efforts. So that diversity, that range, that historical range, and what that means is that this diversity in longleaf is really driven by a variety of soil types. And that, changes nutrient availability, soil chemistry. It's also driven a lot by hydrology. How available is water? We go from very dry sandhills in North Carolina and in the sandhills to very wet mesic savannas along the coast. And so that hydrology is a significant factor. And it only takes a couple inches in some cases to change the hydrology of the system and change the plant community, and therefore some of the animal and insect community that you find. But one of the most important characteristics of longleaf that drives this diversity is fire and fire as not a disturbance in the system so much as a key component in the system. I've heard it referred to as important as rain. Fire is just an integral aspect of what makes longleaf and what keeps longleaf healthy. So today, I feel like I've got 4 presentations in one. I've got 4 topics that I could probably go on about for the duration of the time we have together, but we're going to hit on all of them. And that is how fire helps shape the structure and function of longleaf pine savannas, how plants and animals interact with fire, how fire is used specifically as a tool to help restore and steward longleaf savannas, and then a few tips on how to manage your lands if you're a private landowner specifically. That's what these tips are sort of geared towards. But hopefully a few tidbits and a few things that can pique your curiosity for you to go out and find more information. So with that, I'll start with no fire is the same as the last nor the next, and every fire is different. And that is not to say that you can't put together a burn plan and use and understand the site with which you're in to predict fire behavior and to plan a burn to be conducted safely and to reach the ecological goals and fire effects you desire. But no one fire is identical to the next, even in the same unit. And the reason for that is because the fuel that's available to burn can vary from week to week, even from day to day, based on relative humidity and fuel moistures. Fuel or vegetation patterns change over time, and so that patchiness of available fuel can shift and migrate. Weather conditions are always different, right? And so that different combination can give you different fire effects in the same place on different burn days. You also have things like weather before and after the burn that influence what's going on that day of that burn, how much smoldering you're going to see, if you have any ground fire, things like that. And even the way you conduct that burn, the ignition patterns you use. So saying whether you are utilizing a torch and you're putting down a straight line of fire, or you're putting down dots every 30 feet, or whether you're putting down dashes or some combination, or just how you move firefighters or fire crew with torches through a unit will influence the intensity and the severity of that fire and how it burns. So it's duly noted that planning is critical to implementing a successful burn. But again, when you think about fire effects and how fire influences structure and function and interactions with plants and animals, it is a very dynamic force, and it is always changing and different within the same system. And I just wanted to give a little overview for those of you that aren't familiar with controlled burning. It's just a very simplified schematic of how to think about what we do with burning. This is a burn probably in a grassland, I'm not sure where, but generally in this case, the wind is coming from the lower right-hand corner. You generally start your burn so that where you light, you're actually lighting a backing fire. And so you can see the lower flames in the middle of this burn. That's a backing fire. The fire is chewing and burning fuel into the wind, so you get lower flame lengths, and the fire actually stays in one place a little bit longer. It moves slower. You have some type of brakes that you're putting in before your burn. This is part of your preparation. So in this case, there's a road as a fire break. They might have had a mowed line back here. They might have used some wetting, a UTV with a pump or something to create a black line, something to create a burnt area of fuel, so that as you come around the unit and you ultimately begin to light some of your fire with that wind, you get that head fire that actually pushes into a burnt out area. And that's what helps contain your fire within the unit. So how you burn and those patterns are all really critical to thinking about the effects you want to have, and even things such as leaving escape routes for wildlife, for example. Thinking about that. So there's a lot that goes into it. And this is just in the box down here, just a very simplified brief list of sort of the major resources you have during a controlled burn. And the burn boss is really the person who's 3 steps ahead of everybody, who's thinking about contingency, who's looking for hazards that others can't see, who's monitoring fire effects, who's out there looking and getting a perspective on the burn that is at a larger level than any individual crew member. But then you also have your holding resources that are responsible for helping keep the fire within the unit, putting out any spot fires. You have folks that are responsible for ignitions, actually putting fire on the ground, putting down in certain patterns, trying to mitigate the heat of the fire with certain ignition patterns. And then mop up is making sure that your fire is getting contained and there's nothing near the edge that could threaten to slap over or fall over into the unburned area and escape. So in a nutshell, that's a prescribed burn and what it can look like in a fairly simple unit. And this is just let's see, I wanted to show you a picture. This is actually a prescribed burn at Callaway Forest Preserve. That's a head fire moving in there. And in the background, what you can see is all the black that we had created with a backing fire off of a sand 2-track. And you can see how the flames and just what the head fire is doing and what those fire effects are versus that backing fire can be very different. Sorry, we're gonna forward. And these are just some typical pictures of what you might see burning in Longleaf. So sometimes you'll have burns where you get relatively low flame lengths, fairly fast or fairly slow moving fire. You can also have fires that maybe you have a slightly heavier shrub layer, or you have more thatch on the ground or more needle cast. You might have higher wind conditions or lower H. So you might get flames that can get, easily up to 6 to 8 feet tall and be slightly more severe in nature. And fires do get very large, and especially in the coastal plain, but also in fires that burn into the drains and wet areas up in the sandhills here. So you can get upwards to 30-foot flames. And this happens to be, I believe it was a second burn along this is a fairly wet longleaf pine area that also has some pond pine in it, but a lot of dense shrub material in the understory. And so you can get very intense burns as well. So the range is very different across the entirety of longleaf in North Carolina, and most certainly within the range of longleaf in the US. But I will say every burn that we do, for the most part, there are some burns that are very complete in terms of consuming the grasses or top killing shrubs, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But in general, you get a mosaic. So not everything burns all the time, and you'll have fire that moves through an area, and you'll have hot spots and a lot of consumption. You'll have areas where you just get some browning of shrubs. You might get areas where the fire just stops because there might be a slightly wetter area, or there was a wind shift, or something happened. So really, the nature of fire in our burning is creating a mosaic of fire severity across the unit. And that is a pattern that changes with different burns in different years under different conditions. Sorry about that. So how fire helps shape the structure of longleaf pine savannas. We'll start at the top. We'll start with the trees. Tree density, how many trees you have in a given area. Certainly fire influences that over time. And it may not be a single fire. It's more often multiple fires with varying severities, but influencing that tree canopy, both how many trees you have and how those trees are distributed within an area, really influences light availability. And the key on that is that light availability influences the ground layer diversity. And so that very much influences the biodiversity of the entire system, because then that also influences forage availability, nesting habitat, and it influences the wildlife that you're going to find there and the insects you're going to find there. So controlled burning we can often create some canopy gaps. If we get a hot spot, we can create snags that create additional perching habitat or wildlife habitat. Tree density, especially in the isolated wetlands that are embedded in longleaf, those can often be very overgrown and have lots of trees and shrubs, and fires that move through those areas can help thin out those trees sometimes. And that really influences soil moisture in those isolated wetlands, because those trees, especially this time of year, are sucking up a lot of moisture. And that can very much influence these small, fairly shallow water wetlands, and therefore influence critical habitat for a lot of amphibians and reptiles. The number of trees you have also influences your needle cast, right? So the more trees you have, the more needle cast you're going to have every given year, the more fuel buildup you're going to get. And so these open, sunny savannas there's a balance there of having, enough trees for fuel with the needles, versus a really, really dense canopy and building up fuel quickly. That canopy also influences how heat from your fire dissipates. So if you have a dense canopy that you're burning under, it can often trap the heat more easily and you'll get more scorch on the trees. Whereas if you have a wide open canopy or a more open canopy, some of that heat can be released. And that's not something that I've seen people measure, but it's something I've talked with practitioners about and people see repeatedly. So there's just a tremendous amount that goes on in terms of how the tree canopy influences the entire system, and therefore how fire influences the entire system via the canopies, influencing the canopy. So this is a picture, we call this canopy scorch. It's the browning of the needles after a fire. It's the heat that's released from the fire, browning out those needles, and those needles ultimately fall very quickly to the forest floor. But an adaptation of longleaf to fire is that it does put out needles very quickly after a burn. And we're generally burning in the dormant season into the growing season, not necessarily in the fall in this part of the longleaf range. One other thing you'll see in here too is in the middle of that photo, you see a fairly short mid-story longleaf, and you see in the center that the green needles, and there's still a growth bud there that's untouched by the fire. And so as long as those trees can protect that bud during a fire, they generally will be able to withstand the fire and they will continue to grow. And I'll get into that a little bit more. And this is a picture from our Black River Preserve, and it was a first entry burn. And that's what we refer to as first entry, is a place where we haven't had fire on the ground in recent times. So probably the last 50, 60, 80 years. And this was a first entry burn, and it happened to get really hot in a spot, and it did kill some trees. But when you look at it from more of a landscape level, losing some trees isn't a bad thing, and it's actually creating more of a mosaic in terms of how those, having those canopy gaps, and creating that wildlife habitat. We wouldn't want to do this across the entirety of the savanna, of course, but to have, to look at those where we get those hot spots and where we do get some tree kill, it's really just part of how the fire is moving through the system, and how that intensity changes across the unit, even on the same, during the same day that you're implementing the fire. And this is just a typical, this is Callaway Forest Preserve. It's kind of a typical tree canopy for us across a lot of Callaway, but you'll see, even looking up into the trees, you see those canopy gaps. And so that's what we're really looking for over time. We're not necessarily looking for just a even-aged monotypic stand. We're looking for spatial diversity in those trees, those canopy gaps that allow for regeneration of both longleaf as well as highlight areas for other ground layer species. And this is another picture of one of our more open savannas in Orton Creek, where there's just a few trees. So again, all these places look very different, and fire just plays a very integral role in what you see in terms of tree density as well as the composition. And I'll say fire isn't the only thing. There's a long history of use on these lands, of timbering. And so I don't want to negate the fact that there are other forces that have shaped these places, but fire most certainly historically, and in places where we have high quality savannas, it's critical to what you actually are seeing on the ground. And I'll just say one thing: stump holes, they're really fun. Stump holes, when you have a tree that naturally falls down or a tree that's been cut for a restoration harvest, those stumps are really heavy in resin, and they will catch on fire readily, and they will continue to burn and can burn for several days after a controlled burn. And ultimately that fire burns down into the ground. And because the longleaf taproot is so deep, you end up having these stump holes that can be fairly large and, several feet deep, and they become really important habitat for a variety of wildlife, gopher frogs, snakes, glass lizards. That's what's on the bottom there. I think it's a pine snake in the middle, but a variety of species. And actually, if you go further south you get into gopher tortoise territory. And I think it's been documented that some 300 different species utilize gopher tortoise holes. So just like microsites of diversity because of the unique habitat those stump holes provide. And they also provide opportunities for animals to escape fire. So they also play a role in that way.
Deb, a quick question that just came in. Can you
Yeah.
describe what a restoration harvest is?
So a restoration harvest, I refer to that as a timber harvest that we would do with the goal of restoring the historic range of structure and tree density of a longleaf pine savanna. So that can range tremendously, but it's a harvest that we're doing not with the goal of making the most money possible, but we're really with the goal of getting someone in there that can cut the trees that we want with the goal of restoring that longleaf pine savanna in mind. So I use that term because I think it can be different than just a timber harvest that occurs, and I don't want to confuse the two.
Thank you.
Fire also plays a significant role in regeneration of longleaf pine, right? In several different ways. The consumption of the grasses, the duff, the pine needles on the forest floor, when longleaf drops its seed and it gets better soil contact, it's a higher likelihood of germination. That's generally true for many, many species. And longleaf can germinate on thicker duff, but it does better and germinates more readily on that mineral soil. Longleaf also can be in the first year, when it's in its very first sort of grass stage, fire can kill longleaf. And so it does influence sort of those regeneration patterns and where that patchiness is of that fire versus where your seedlings are. But a couple of years of growth, and honestly, the longleaf is really resilient to fire, even in that small grass stage. It has its growth bud right below the mineral soil when it's in the grass stage, and it's pumping a lot of nutrients into its roots. And as it's doing that, it's just sort of sitting there on the surface with just a few needles, and indeed does look like grass. But once the conditions are right, whether that's a light gap or it just has enough storage of energy and nutrients in the roots, it will bolt up. And the picture on the right is a bolting longleaf. And it takes a couple years, but the plant grows fairly rapidly to get basically to like 3 or 4 or 5 feet. And that gets it above that zone of the general flame length. And now we talked about how that can vary from fire to fire, but the general flame length that you would see in a typical longleaf fire. And that gets it out of that zone, that threatening zone. And as long, again, as that white bud in the center stays white after a fire, doesn't get burnt up, that tree will most likely survive and continue to grow. It's got thick bark already when it's a young tree. It's got needles that are more dense next to that apical bud. So when the fire hits, they're actually protecting that bud as the needles are releasing moisture. So longleaf definitely influences regeneration, both promoting it and sometimes thinning out the seedlings. But it is critical to that life stage of longleaf as well. And this is just, I like this picture because it just shows a longleaf during the growing season. They usually start to bolt right about early to mid-April. And this is just a picture of a fire that moved through that, it was hot enough to singe and brown those needles on the bottom, but you see that growth bud is already elongated and it's putting out new needles, and that tree will do just fine during that growing season and in the future. I will say that when you put fire into the longleaf system, and if you do get fairly severe effects and you get scorching and like a higher severity fire, and then you also have drought following that, you can get beetle infestations, and you can have tree mortality. So that combination of effects, a combination of things happening in succession, can be detrimental to the trees. But in general, longleaf does better with more frequent fire than less frequent fire. Another aspect of the longleaf ecosystem that fire is critical to is the shrub in the mid-story layer, sort of that 12 feet and below roughly. And the picture here is of a longleaf savanna that hasn't seen fire for some time. And in a lot of these systems, you'll see the mid-story grow up fairly rapidly, especially along the coastal plain in the more mesic savannas. Within 5 years, you can see shrubs that grow from ground level up to 6 or 7 feet easily and even higher. And so why does that matter? Well, similar to having a really dense canopy of trees, having a really dense canopy of shrubs reduces the light availability at the ground level, can suppress the ground layer, and you can lose that diversity that makes longleaf so tremendously unique. That also then changes the whole dynamics of what's available for forage, nesting, and habitat for the species that would characteristically be there. The shrubs also change the litter or the fuel that a fire would use. So if you get an understory of a lot of oak or other shrubs and you suppress the grasses, all of a sudden your fuel is some pine needles if you still can maintain the longleaf, and a lot of broadleaf leaves. And so just right there, how that litter burns and what conditions it burns under, that changes compared to when you would see wiregrass and pine needles burn. So a lot of things change when you change that habitat structure in the species that are most abundant. And that is true. Most of you have probably heard of the red-cockaded woodpecker. In places where longleaf has been fire suppressed and you get a tall, dense mid-story, that is going to change the habitat, and red-cockaded woodpeckers do not have an affinity for dense shrubs and large expanses of dense shrubs. Shrubs are important in the longleaf ecosystem. I don't want to make that, I want to make that point, but it's generally in a patchiness. And we feel that there are species like the red-cockaded woodpecker that they're an indicator species. When they're present, you probably have some dynamic, some patchiness and abundance of shrubs mixed with a herbaceous layer and an open canopy that is within the range of a healthy longleaf system. So largely our burns top kill shrubs. This is a picture out at our Orton Creek Preserve after a burn we did. And generally what you see, a lot of blackened stems after a burn. And again, it's going to be patchy, but you see top kill. And this is another picture. I believe this was up at Callaway possibly. But anyways, you just see, the leaves are singed, stems are burnt. But in a few months during, if you do a dormant season burn, for example, those shrubs are going to resprout. They are also adapted to fire. So you're going to see them resprout, and sometimes resprout very aggressively as a response to fire. And so there's a lot of discussion about the benefits of doing growing season burns to control shrub density versus dormant season burns. And there's a general sense that growing season burns can result in more actual kill of the shrubs, actually scorching and burning the root crown and killing the shrub versus just the top kill. And generally, dormant season burns are going to give you predominantly top kills. So you're sort of resetting the clock on the stature of these shrubs, but they're still going to be present. They're still going to have, they're still part of the composition in the same way they were. So a lot of people push towards growing season burns in part because of the fire effects you'll have on shrubs. And then we also have the ground layer, one of the most, critical aspects of the longleaf system in terms of diversity, and fire very much influences that. It's some of it's as simple as fire moving through and removing the thatch, removing the duff and the litter, and creating open areas that warm up earlier in the spring, and that plants aren't fighting through all of that thatch. It's more sunny, open area, warmer soils. We've done some work with Dr. Roger Shue at UNCW and his wife Dale monitoring fly traps. That picture on the right is taken out at the Green Swamp. And their work over the last 12 years of doing monitoring on permanent transects, counting fly traps and counting the flowers produced by fly traps, has given us some information related when looking at when we had been burning over the last 12 years, looking at growing season burns versus dormant season burns, and how many fly traps were flowering and how many they saw. And basically, they've been able to give us a management recommendation that I believe it's every 18 months. And alternating between growing season and dormant burns, you'll see that growing season burns increases the growth, the production of flowers in the subsequent years, and then that diminishes over time. And so a combination of growing season and dormant season burns is important for putting fire on the ground to promote fly traps and other rare species. They've been looking at roughleaf loosestrife as well and are finding somewhat similar results. So I guess the key point here and a takeaway would be it's important to change up your seasonality of burning, your timing of burning, and the conditions under which you're burning, so that your fire effects have basically a wide variety of effects. I think that's important because for many species, we don't have data that tells us how they're responding. And so I think changing up your timing and the conditions under which you're burning, and even your ignition patterns, if you can, burning with different winds, if you can, if you're not constrained by smoke sensitive areas or other issues, that will change how the fire moves through a unit, and it'll change the effects that it has for the multitude of different species. And there's so many amazing plants out there. Golden sedge is another rare species that grows in places where it absolutely needs fire. It needs some amount of sunlight to persist, more in our mesic savannas. You've got milkweeds, you've got orchids, and I'll say one special note about our nitrogen fixtures, our legumes. They are really important plants in this system. Longleaf is largely on sandy soils, ranging from wet to dry, but fairly low nutrient soils. And those species in the legume family are nitrogen fixers. And so they're helping put nitrogen into a system that is fairly nitrogen poor to begin with. And so just a note on those, a lot of those species are also ones that need fairly open, sunny conditions to persist and grow. So wildlife related. So we have the red cockaded woodpecker that nests in live longleaf trees. We have Bachman sparrow, which is also indicative of longleaf and a declining species. This bird happens to nest on the ground, and so it needs very dense herbaceous areas for cover and nesting. And so again, there's a whole range of species that utilize different layers in this longleaf ecosystem, but all of them are relying on some of the same conditions. Although red cockaded woodpeckers may not be inclined to be in a place with high shrub density, you're not going to get Bachman sparrow there either, because you're not going to have the ground layer species, the density of grass that they would need to be able to nest either. So a lot of species that give us good indicators of what a healthy system is. And I'll just say this, a lot of people ask me, well, where do the wildlife go? What do they do? It destroys the habitat. They won't come back. And honestly, the truth is that there's a lot of, there are species, there are individuals that can be negatively impacted by a fire when it happens. But overall, the impact of that fire on the system as a whole is necessary to maintain the habitat that all those species rely on. And this is just a picture that shows it's a bear tree out at the Green Swamp. And it was within a week after a fire we had out there last June. And we already saw bear coming back into that tree, marking it, and we're finding hair on that tree because they were scratching on it. These bear moved out of that place when it was burning, but they immediately came back even before plants started to regrow, before there was forage available. And the forage that is growing back there now is really high in nutrients and more succulent than what was there prior to the burn. So there's a lot of positive longer term impacts for these species that far outweigh a lot of the short term impacts. In that statement, scale matters. And I think insects and invertebrates, that's a whole nother consideration and puzzle, and a challenge to understand with the high diversity of those species and what the impacts are of fire. But again, if you can't maintain the habitat, you won't maintain the species. And so fire is a management tool. We use fire in a variety of different ways. We kind of lump it into kind of different categories. But for places where we're doing longleaf planting in, say, old agricultural fields, we'll often use fire for site preparation. And so we're trying to remove the duff. We're trying to open up space for planting, increase ease of planting, get rid of slash if the area was cut, and that's woody debris on the ground. So we'll use it for site preparation for both longleaf tree planting and wiregrass planting. And the picture to the right is a 3-year-old stand of longleaf up at our Jordan Preserve in the Sandhills that is just growing tremendously right now. But so we often use fire as a site prep. Sometimes on the day of burn or a couple days before a burn, we'll actually go in and use fire to burn around red cockaded woodpecker trees. This is something that our partners do more often than us, some of our partners, but it's a way to blacken an area around an RCW tree, put out that fire so that when you do light the controlled burn in a subsequent day or future time, you don't have to worry as much about protecting those trees, trying to prevent fire from going up the side of the tree where there's an abundance of sap and what have you. So that's a type of preparation, but it's a preparation. It's using fire to prepare a unit for controlled burning. And then we have first entry burns. And that I mentioned before is putting fire back into a place that historically had fire, but it's been absent for many, many decades. And the conditions in those sites can often be very different than in a fire-maintained longleaf system. You get a buildup of duff, of litter, of needles, of sometimes grasses, leaf litter, and that builds up over time and it becomes partially decomposed. So it holds moisture, it has a little more nutrients in it than the mineral soils underneath, and that can be very thick. It can be, it can be up to 6-8 inches sometimes, depending on where you are. And so those first entry burns, you're burning under conditions that are fairly cool and fairly moist. You're trying not to burn all of that duff at once. And part of the reason for that is because the trees over time, when they have that moisture in the duff and that nutrients, they'll start to put fibrous roots up into it rather than down in the mineral soil. So they've got roots in the mineral soil, but they'll start to spread those roots up into that duff. And if you were to burn all of that duff, especially a very thick layer off, all at once, you would actually end up girdling those trees. And so your strategies and your tactics and your conditions under which you would burn on a first entry burn are going to be different than burns that you would do when a site has seen a number of burns and that duff layer has been slowly thinned out and removed. And this is another first entry burn. This was actually, the crew was out yesterday burning this site again, but this was a first entry burn at our McLean Savannah Ryan tract. There's a lot of cane in there. But again, this was a pretty wet day. It wasn't raining wet, but the fuel moisture was high. The conditions were fairly mild, but you still get good burns through these units. You still get good consumption of vegetation. And again, it's a process of several years or several burns trying to get a place, a savanna back to a state where you're more in a quote unquote maintenance mode. And that's what I'm calling stewardship burning here. This is where you are using fire to maintain the healthy, functioning, dynamic system that longleaf is. Fire is critical too. And the interval for returning fire when you're doing stewardship burning or just as like that maintenance, it can be anywhere from every 1 to 2 years to 5 years. And it depends on the community type you're working in. And really what's necessary within that system. And this is just a typical burn that you would see in one of our savannas. I believe this is shoestring out at the Green Swamp. And so again, in this place, we've had fire in the Green Swamp for decades. And so when we burn these savannas, it's very much maintenance type burning. We've got very healthy systems, very diverse systems, and we switch up dormant versus growing season. So that's kind of our goal for our fire management program and for our preserves, is to get to this sort of stewardship maintenance burning over time. And finally, the tips on how to use good fire. the very first thing that came to my mind was be a lifelong student. I've been burning a long time, and I still feel like when I get into new fuel types, I'm always learning something. There's always something to be observed and understood, whether it's fire effects after a burn, whether it's techniques and tactics during a burn, whether it's new safety measures that you can implement, or better communications. There's always something to be learned in terms of fire. So to be a lifelong student, I think, is a fair statement, and that you could start anytime. This happens to be a student who is doing their first burn with us to get their basic wildland firefighter training. But honestly, you can start learning and utilizing fire at any point. And I think North Carolina, especially in the Southeast, can set up private landowners for a great deal of success. And the ways that that's happening is primarily through prescribed burn associations. And they are really community-based groups of landowners that want to support and help one another in conducting prescribed burns. And these aren't necessarily huge burns. They're often less than 40 acres. But it is a way of pooling resources together to, as a community, support one another in putting good fire on the ground. And with that, and with PBAs, comes having mentors or folks that have been burning that can help share that knowledge, and that you can burn together to learn how to do it. And it may not look the same as the burns that the Nature Conservancy would do. It may be evening burns when people are done with work, pending smoke. But so it's a really wonderful model for connecting people that want to use good fire on their land. And I can say fire is one of the things that so easily brings people together, as a team, working together, collaborating. There's a beauty to it. There is a spirit to it, and it feels really good to be putting down fire in the Longleaf system and doing good work. North Carolina has a lot of prescribed burn associations. Many are in different stages of how much they're burning or what state they're at, but there are a number of them. And this is, I believe, NC State webpage. So if you look up prescribed burn associations in North Carolina, you can click around on this map and you can find out which PBA is in your area. And you can connect with that PBA, and you can start learning, start participating in burns if they're conducting them. You can observe, or you could continue, you could just start advancing your skills if you're thinking about fire on your own property. And that said, the North Carolina Forest Service has a certified burner program. And so to put fire on the ground, becoming a certified burner is a good idea. It gives you some basic training, and it helps you work through the process of writing a burn plan, knowing what permits to obtain, understanding smoke management, which is really, really important, especially in places where you're on an interface with small towns or smoke sensitive areas like hospitals or schools. And it also helps connect you to do and conduct a burn with another certified burner. So it's another way of mentoring and supporting folks, and helping train folks into conducting their own burns. So you can go to the North Carolina Forest Service website and learn about that certified burner program, and they offer classes annually. And then there's this guidebook. If you're someone that likes to read and learn from reading, or do that first, this is a very comprehensive guidebook on prescribed burning, that goes through all of the planning processes and thinking about resources and weather, and just a whole lot of information, all the things that folks that are prescribed fire practitioners have to think about, especially burn bosses, when conducting a prescribed burn. And the last thing I'll say about a tip for putting good fire on the ground, it's not about striking the match. That's what everybody thinks about, and that's the part that is, that's exciting, and it's the sexy part about it. But 90% of the effort that goes into prescribed burning is the planning. It's the planning before, it's the thinking about, 6 months ahead of time or a year ahead of time. What is the unit? getting a burn plan in place, really walking through all the elements of that burn plan and thinking it through, thinking about contingency. What if something goes wrong? What's my next plan? Thinking about the weather conditions you would be looking for and the fire effects you want. It's a lot of thought and thinking, and then putting your resources together the day of. Once you strike that match, all those other things should be in place. So I'll just emphasize that it's really important to plan carefully and thoughtfully, and with safety at the forefront when you're putting fire on the ground. But when you do get to that point and you're able to put fire on your property for the first time or for the 20th time, I think every time I'm on a prescribed burn, there is just a huge sense of satisfaction about the work that's being done, and how good it feels to put fire down in a system that's, you know, driven by fire and the species that will benefit from it, and the people that will enjoy being in these savannas and walking through them or utilizing them. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions. And if you want to ask me anything about things I didn't cover, there's any number of things I could have covered in all 4 categories. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Deb. We had one come in during the presentation, but I encourage all of our attendees to share any more questions they may have. Either type those in the chat or use the Q&A tool. Could you share some factors that might encourage pine beetle infestations?
So I'm not an expert on pine beetle infestations. I'll say that first and foremost, but I have heard that there can be that combined effect of like having a fairly severe hot fire that causes a lot of scorch and a lot of stress on the longleaf trees, that followed by the stress of a drought can often has been known to cause beetle infestations. And that's primarily what I know about pine beetle and what I think about in terms of that.
Sure. Thank you. Well, thank you all once again for attending. Thank you, Deb, for joining us today in this fantastic
Thank you.
presentation. And I hope everyone has a wonderful Thursday. We hope to see you at future Saving Our Savannas programs. Lauren just put into the chat our short Longleaf link. If you enter that into your web browser, you'll be taken to a list of all of our upcoming programs. Thank you all once again.
Thank you. Bye.